Welcome to the Hoja on Architecture podcast. The Origins of Architecture. Chapter 8. The Concept of the Proto-City. In the previous chapter, we explored how monumentality transformed architecture into a symbolic language capable of expressing belief, ritual, memory, and collective identity. We examined how ritual environments gradually concentrated social meaning within architectural space, allowing communities to stabilize symbolic experience materially. In this chapter, we move from monumentality to settlement complexity itself. The discussion shifts from symbolic centers to interconnected systems of life, from collective ritual to organized density, and from monumental gathering to the earliest forms of proto-urban thinking. Cities are often understood as products of advanced civilization. Dense populations, organized infrastructure, administrative systems, and monumental public architecture are typically treated as defining characteristics of urban life. Yet the city's origins date back long before the fully developed urban civilization emerged. The proto-city represents an intermediate condition in which settlements began to function not merely as collections of buildings but as increasingly interconnected spatial systems. This transformation marks one of the most important thresholds in architectural history because it changes how settlements operate socially, spatially, and psychologically. Earlier settlements certainly contained houses, communal areas, ritual spaces, and agricultural organization. However, proto-urban environments introduced a new level of density, continuity, and interdependence between architectural elements. Space increasingly functioned as a coordinated network rather than isolated structures distributed across a landscape. The emergence of density fundamentally transformed spatial relationships. As settlements expanded, available land became increasingly limited within inhabited zones. Buildings moved closer together, circulation became more compressed, and domestic environments became more interconnected physically. Architecture therefore began negotiating proximity at unprecedented scales. This proximity altered the experience of movement itself. In some proto-urban settlements, circulation no longer depended primarily on open ground pathways between detached structures. Instead, movement increasingly occurred through narrow passages, interconnected spaces, elevated routes, or even rooftops. Architecture began functioning not simply as an isolated enclosure, but as a continuous spatial fabric. The image of a settlement traversed through roofs rather than streets reveals something deeply significant about proto-urban thinking. The settlement was no longer experienced as a series of separate buildings set beside one another, but as an integrated architectural organism. Individual houses contributed to larger collective systems of circulation, protection, and spatial continuity. Architecture therefore became increasingly systemic. This systemic quality also transformed the relationship between private and communal life. Earlier settlements often preserved stronger distinctions between individual structures and shared open space. Dense proto-urban environments, however, increasingly blurred these boundaries. Domestic life, movement, labor, storage, and collective interaction became deeply entangled spatially. Architecture therefore mediated social complexity at entirely new scales. At the same time, proto-urban environments should not be understood simply as early cities in a modern sense. Many lacked formal infrastructure, centralized administration, or rigid urban planning systems associated with later civilizations. What matters instead is the emergence of spatial interdependence. Settlements were becoming structurally and socially inseparable networks of life. This interdependence intensified the importance of architectural organization. Ventilation, circulation, storage, waste management, proximity to resources, and movement patterns all became increasingly significant in dense settlements. Architecture therefore began to respond not only to environmental conditions, but also to the pressures created by collective density itself. The proto-city also transformed the relationship between architecture and visibility. Dense settlements increase exposure to others' presence because sound, movement, smoke, labor, and domestic activity overlap continuously. Human life becomes spatially compressed. Architecture therefore increasingly regulates observation, interaction, and coexistence within shared environments. This compression contributed directly to the emergence of more complex social organization. Larger and denser settlements require coordination beyond the household scale. Labor systems, storage management, ritual activity, conflict resolution, and communal cooperation all become more spatially demanding under proto-urban conditions. Architecture therefore evolved alongside increasing social complexity. At the same time, density also produces vulnerability. Fire spreads more easily, Waste accumulates more rapidly, disease risk intensifies, and environmental pressures increase in concentrated settlements. Proto-urban environments, therefore, reveal that architectural complexity emerges simultaneously with new forms of fragility. The settlement becomes both more organized and more vulnerable at once. This tension remains fundamental to urban life even today. Cities continuously balance connectivity with congestion, density with risk, visibility with anonymity, and collective interaction with environmental pressure. Proto-urban settlements therefore already contain many of the spatial contradictions that continue shaping urban environments throughout history. The proto-city additionally transforms the relationship between architecture and temporality. Dense settlements accumulate layers of modification across generations. Walls are repaired, spaces are expanded, circulation routes shift, and structures adapt continuously through use. Architecture increasingly becomes an evolving process rather than a series of isolated constructions. Settlements acquire historical depth materially. This layered quality contributes directly to the emergence of urban memory. The settlement gradually stores traces of repeated occupation through accumulated architectural transformation. Space begins recording collective life physically across time. Architecture therefore becomes not only a framework for habitation, but also an archive of continuous human presence. The proto-city also changes how humans perceive belonging itself. In smaller settlements, social identity often depends primarily on direct interpersonal relationships. Larger proto-urban environments, however, encourage identification with settlement systems extending beyond immediate family groups. Architecture therefore begins mediating belonging at collective scales larger than domestic continuity alone. This transformation contributes directly to the emergence of territorial consciousness. Dense settlements increasingly distinguish insiders from outsiders through spatial continuity and collective organization. Architecture therefore participates more visibly in defining social boundaries, communal identity, and territorial presence. The settlement itself becomes a cultural entity. At the same time, proto-urban environments remain deeply connected to environmental realities. Early dense settlements still depended heavily on agricultural continuity, local material systems, climatic responsiveness, and ecological adaptation. Urban thinking had not yet separated architecture from environmental dependency. The proto-city therefore remained simultaneously artificial and ecological. This reveals something essential about the origins of urbanism. Cities did not emerge suddenly through abstract planning or technological superiority alone. They emerged gradually through increasing layers of settlement complexity, collective coordination, environmental negotiation, and spatial interdependence. The proto-city represents this transitional condition between village continuity and urban civilization. The concept of the proto-city therefore marks a profound transformation in architectural history. Architecture was no longer limited to isolated structures, symbolic monuments, or domestic environments alone. Settlements themselves were becoming integrated systems, organizing movement, interaction, memory, density, labor, and collective existence simultaneously. Architecture was beginning to operate at the scale of civilization. In the next chapter, we will move from proto-urban complexity to the environmental intelligence of vernacular architecture. We will examine how early societies developed architectural responses deeply shaped by climate, geography, material conditions, and ecological adaptation. The discussion will shift from density to environment, from settlement systems to local knowledge, and from proto-urban organization to the emergence of vernacular thinking before architects themselves existed. Because once settlements became increasingly complex, the next transformation became inevitable, learning how to adapt architecture systematically to the conditions of place itself. This concludes Chapter 8 of The Origins of Architecture, the concept of the proto-city. Thanks for listening. See you in the next episode.